Well, last week, as we've been going through 2 Samuel, we saw a passage that was all about loyalty to God's true king. This week, as we continue in 2 Samuel, we're going to see a passage that talks about what about those people who aren't loyal to God's true king? What about the people who are enemies of God's king, who intentionally go against him? And more specifically, what about how do we deal with those people in our lives? When we run into people who are enemies of Christ, enemies of God, and we are dealing with them in our lives, what should that look like? It's clear throughout Scripture, in this passage and in many, many others, that there will be enemies of God in this world, that in this world we'll have trouble, that in this world there are those who hate Christ and will kind of fight against us. And we can just see this as we look around in our world. We can see that there are people out there who try to take advantage of Christians and of their generosity. You can think of any prosperity preacher who uses the things of God, pretends like they are, a Christian. They use the Bible. They look like they're following God, but actually they're just lining their pockets, and they get caught buying jets, and they get caught doing all this stuff because they're taking advantage of God's people, because they are an enemy of God's true king. You can look up, this happens all the time. I found just one example of a church in Nashville a couple days ago. Somebody got arrested because they were embezzling money from the church. People try to take advantage of Christ's church, of Christ's people. People also will try to not just take advantage, they just straight up hate God's people. They will curse them. Just recently, just some other examples from our world. The recently elected Cooks County State's Attorney is very pro-choice and is accusing Christians who come to pray outside clinics of being violent, promising to stop them, calling what they're doing hateful. And again, even more than cursing, just last week there was a school shooting at a Christian school in Madison, Wisconsin. This world is antagonistic and hateful towards Christ and his church. But it's not just stuff out there that happens. This happens in our own personal lives. Maybe during this Christmas season, hopefully you are going to travel to be with family for a joyous time spent together. But maybe some of us are going where we have relatives or friends who aren't Christians, who try to take advantage of our generosity. They try and or maybe there's just straight up tension because you know that they don't like you, don't like your beliefs. They accuse you of things you don't do. You can imagine this happens all the time. You try to lovingly talk to someone about their sin, your relative, your friend, your family member, and instead of, they receive it not by listening to what you say, but saying, you know what, you hate me. You just hate me. They're falsely accusing you of hating them. You don't hate them, you love them. That's why you're talking to them about their sin, and they come back and just accuse you of hating them. And there's this tension in our lives as Christ followers that there will be people in the world who try to take advantage of us and try to curse us. And I want to just show you guys this morning, just to be clear, it's not actually you. You're not the reason why people hate you. It's not your personality, although maybe for some of us, our personality doesn't help. but you're not actually the reason why they hate you. They hate you because you are a loyal citizen of Christ's kingdom. Christ told us in John chapter 16 that the world will hate us because they first hated Christ. The problem is not necessarily with you. The problem is the fact that there is a king of the universe. His name is Jesus. He is in control. He will come again to judge the living and the dead. And because you are a loyal citizen of his kingdom, those who are enemies of his kingdom are going to attack you, are going to try and take advantage of you, are going to try and curse you. This passage this morning in 2 Samuel 16 is going to show us how we should respond when that happens. When someone is hating us or cursing us because of what we believe about Jesus, because we follow him loyally, how do we respond to that person? As we pick up in our passage in 2 Samuel 16, David is currently on the run again. After all of 1 Samuel being on the run from Saul, now David's own son Absalom has staged a coup and he's going to take over the kingdom from David. He's on his way, marching to Jerusalem to take the kingdom away from David. So David and his family and his entourage of followers flee from the city. And last chapter we saw people who were loyal to David. As he's kind of leaving Jerusalem, he keeps encountering people along the road who are talking to him as he's leaving. Last chapter, we saw people who were loyal to him, his friends, his family, his loyal followers who are trying to help him as he leaves. This morning, as we begin in chapter 16, we're going to see two encounters with his enemies. These are people who are not loyal to David. In fact, both of these people, it seems, are still loyal to King Saul. They're still hung up on Saul before David even came into power. So David's going to now encounter these two enemies, and as we see them interact with David, we're going to see in David the way that people interact with Christ. David is God's true king, and these are his enemies kind of attacking him. The same thing happens to Christ in his life, his enemies attacking him as God's true king, and now for us, as followers of that king, we also will receive those attacks. So we're going to see David, which points to Christ, which points to us as we read in this passage. So let's begin with verse 1 here. We're going to read the first 4 verses of 2 Samuel 16. When David had passed a little beyond the summit, Ziba, the servant of Mephibosheth, met him, with a couple of donkeys saddled, bearing 200 loaves of bread, 100 bunches of raisins, 100 of summer fruits, and a skin of wine. And the king said to Ziba, "Why have you brought these?" Ziba answered, "The donkeys are for the king's household to ride on, and the bread and summer fruit are for the young men to eat, and the wine for those who faint in the wilderness to drink." And the king said, "Where is your master's son?" Ziba said to the king, "Behold, he remains in Jerusalem, for he said, 'Today the house of Israel will give me back the kingdom of my father.'" Then the king said to Ziba, "Behold, all that belonged to Mephibosheth is now yours." And Ziba said, "I pay homage. Let me ever find favor in your sight, my lord the king." While this first section of the passage might at first look like somebody trying to help David, what's really happening here is that the enemies of God's king will try to take advantage of him for their own gain. God's enemies, the enemies of his king, those who are not loyal to the king, are going to try and take advantage of the king for their own personal gain. If you guys remember Ziba, this guy Ziba is a servant of Saul. He was Saul's servant originally, and now he is serving Saul's grandson Mephibosheth. This is Jonathan's son, Mephibosheth, who's lame, he can't walk. Back in chapter 9 of 2 Samuel, David was like, "Guys, I need somebody from Saul's house. I made a covenant with Jonathan. I want to bless him." He finds Mephibosheth. He gives Mephibosheth everything that was Saul, all of Saul's inheritance, all of Saul's stuff, all go to Mephibosheth. So he is now very rich. But he is also lame and can't actually work all the fields and all this stuff. So David commands Ziba to take care of all that stuff for Mephibosheth. For the rest of Ziba's life, him and his family are now just serving Jonathan's son Mephibosheth. So he goes from being Saul's servant to now being kind of ordered to take care of Mephibosheth. And you might imagine that Ziba was not that happy about that arrangement. The text doesn't say that explicitly, but you can imagine going from kind of having all your whole family, your fields and everything, and now you're just serving this one guy just because the king told you to. So as David is being driven out of Jerusalem, Ziba kind of sees this opportunity. David has just crossed over the Mount of Olives. He's going down the hill, and Ziba comes up to him, bringing what are clearly like supplies for the road, right? Donkeys, food, wine. Immediately, David's going to see this and go, "Okay, obviously this is stuff for me for my journey." But David is suspicious. He's like, "But why is Ziba here?" He's kind of on his guard. He's escaping. Here's a servant of Saul coming out of nowhere with help for him, and he might be a little suspicious. He's also suspicious because Mephibosheth isn't with him. David gave Mephibosheth everything. He made him rich. He sat him at his own table. He treated him as a son for no reason at all besides his love and covenant with Jonathan. So he sees Ziba, no Mephibosheth, and he's suspicious. And he asks Ziba in verse 2, "Why have you brought this stuff?" He doesn't ask what the stuff is. He knows what the stuff is. It's donkeys. You ride on them. It's clear what's happening. But he asks why. He wants to know Ziba's motivation. Ziba does not answer the question in verse 2. He doesn't answer why. He just says what? He goes, "Well, they're donkeys to ride on. Come on, it's provisions. Don't you need help? Aren't you fleeing Jerusalem? Aren't you going to be in the wilderness again? Don't you need stuff?" The king, still suspicious, in verse 3 goes, "But where's Mephibosheth? What are you doing out here, man? Why isn't Mephibosheth here?" And here Ziba takes his opportunity to take advantage of the situation and gain riches for himself, steal them back from Mephibosheth. He lies to the king about Mephibosheth, and he tells David that he betrayed him. He says, "Hey, He saw you get driven out of the city, and he goes, yes, I'm going to get the throne now. And he basically tells David, he betrayed you, man. He betrayed you. I'm with you. He's against you now. I think we have lots of reasons, just based on this text, to really doubt Ziba's story here. You'll notice the narrator didn't say Ziba was lying. But let me just show you a few reasons just from this why we can pretty much guess that he's lying, and then we get it confirmed later. First of all, Mephibosheth has no reason to betray David at all. It doesn't make any sense. David made him rich. David made him like a son in his own house. David loves this guy. He has no reason to betray him. He's never shown any inclination to try and take the throne. David has only been good to him. He has no reason to betray him. It doesn't make sense. As you're reading in 2 Samuel, you read this, you go, Mephibosheth betrayed him? That doesn't make any sense. Also, Mephibosheth is lame. He can't walk, and therefore he is easy to take advantage of. It's easy to imagine Ziba going, oh, here's my chance. Mephibosheth can't stop me, and taking off without his permission and lying about him. And finally, even the reason he gives doesn't make that much sense. How in the world is Absalom taking over Jerusalem going to give Saul his throne back? Going to give Mephibosheth the throne? If David can't stop his son, David, this great warrior with all these mighty men, if he can't stop his son from taking the throne, how is one lame guy going to take the throne from Absalom? It doesn't make any sense. He could, it just doesn't make a lot of sense. So we should be suspicious of what Ziba's saying here. And then I'll give you a sneak peek ahead to chapter 19. Later on in 2 Samuel, it's confirmed he was lying. He was lying about this whole thing. As David in chapter 19 comes back into the city, he meets Mephibosheth on the road, and he says, hey, how come you didn't come with me when I fled? And we see that Mephibosheth is in mourning. The whole time David was gone, his hair's long. He hasn't washed his clothes. He's got, the sackcloth and ashes. He's devastated that David was driven out of the kingdom. He didn't betray David. He was one of the most loyal people to David. He just couldn't go with him because Ziba tricked him, he says. He says, get my donkey ready. Ziba takes the donkey, goes, lies about Mephibosheth, and takes all of Saul's stuff. That's what happens in verse 4. David is feeling betrayed. He's already been betrayed by his son. He's been betrayed by his top advisor. And now Mephibosheth betrays him. He's devastated. And he believes Ziba's story, whether he just wants the supplies or whether he just needs to get out of town fast. He makes a snap judgment here, and he gives all of the wealth of Saul to Ziba. And now Ziba has successfully come to God's king, not because he's loyal to him. Here's the bottom line of what's happening here. Ziba's pretending to be loyal. He looks like he's trying to follow God's king, trying to help David, but he's actually just doing it for his own gain. He's just doing it for his own gain. He just wants to get rich and get all that stuff from Saul, of Saul's inheritance, and he does there in verse 4. He gives everything that Mephibosheth had to Ziba. This type of thing where someone comes, approaches God's king, appearing to be loyal, appearing to want to follow him, to want to help him, to want to be with them, but actually is just in it for their own gain. This happens all the time. It happened to Jesus in his earthly ministry. It happened in the Christmas story. As we think we're in this Advent season, as soon as Christ is born, there's already people trying to falsely kind of be like, yeah, Jesus, I want to worship you, and then have their own ends in mind. I'm thinking of Herod, right? The wise men come. Herod's like, hey, tell me where this guy is. I want to go worship him. Let's go. Come on. When in fact, of course, he wants to kill him. He wants to kill his political rival. He's pretending to be loyal to Jesus, to the new king, for his own personal gain. So right away, as Jesus is born on earth, people are already trying to take advantage of him. Another example is in John chapter 6. Jesus feeds the 5,000. He goes across the lake. They all wake up. They go, where'd he go? Where'd he go? They track him down. They find him. And they're like, Jesus, how about you teach us some more? He goes, you don't want me to teach you. You just want food. You just want another free meal. That's a less severe example than Herod, but still it's the same idea of people are approaching Christ, the true king, seeming like they're loyal to him, but actually they're just in it for themselves. Maybe the biggest example in the Gospels is Judas, one of Jesus' closest earthly friends. Is close to him, is following him, looks like a true follower, and at the end of the day, betrays Christ for his own personal gain of 30 pieces of silver. This has continued to happen through church history. As you read Acts and the epistles, you've got Ananias and Sapphira in Acts chapter 5. They're coming with their offerings to the church. They're like, guys, look, we're giving so much. We sold our fields. We're giving all of it to you. And God strikes them dead because they were holding back stuff for themselves. In the epistles, we see these so-called super apostles in 2 Corinthians who were these eloquent preachers, great orators, who were charging exorbitant fees to the Corinthians for them to come preach in their church, basically lining their own pockets while looking like they were there to preach. And this, of course, still happens in our world today. I mentioned already prosperity preachers, those who would use the Bible, use God's word, look like they're faithfully trying to follow God when at the end of the day they are trying to line their own pockets. People who take advantage of Christians' generosity, people who don't need help but know the church will help them if they go ask them for it. Maybe friends and family who are like, come on, man, I thought you're supposed to be a Christian. Help me out, man. Aren't Christians supposed to love me? Come on. It happens all the time. And people get away with it. As much as it is so egregious and angering to us, people like Ziba get away with this. David was tricked. He got away with the money. And you'll see in chapter 19, he ends up keeping the money. Mephibosheth just lets him keep it. It's unbelievable that this guy gets away with this. And it's wrong. It's upsetting. And it's going to continue to happen to Christ's people because we are loyal to the king. And there are those who will pretend to be loyal, but just come for their own gain. It could even be just coming to church for the wrong reasons. Coming to a smaller church like ours, wanting to gain influence, wanting to feel powerful, or just wanting to come for community, trying to just get all that you can get out of it, and you're not bringing anything to the table. You're not actually worshiping. You're just there to get what you can get out of it. This will happen in our lives. And as we continue reading in the passage, we're going to see what we should do about that. First, it gets worse than just being taken advantage of. There are also people who will curse us because we follow the true king. Look at verse 5 through 8. When King David came to Bahurim, there came out a man of the family of the house of Saul, whose name was Shimei, the son of Gera. And as he came, he cursed continually. And he threw stones at David and at all the servants of King David, and all the people and all the mighty men were on his right hand and on his left. And Shimei said as he cursed, Get out, you man of blood, you worthless man. The Lord has avenged on you all the blood of the house of Saul, in whose place you have reigned, and the Lord has given the kingdom into the hand of your son Absalom. See, your evil is on you, for you are a man of blood. What we see as David continues down the road is that the enemies of God's king will not just try to trick him and take advantage of him for their own gain. They'll just curse him straight up because they hate him. This guy Shimei, he's kind of this disgruntled relative of Saul. He's from the tribe of Benjamin, and he's still hanging on to the glory days of like, we were supposed to be, Benjamin was supposed to be in charge, man. Saul was supposed to be the king. And this guy, David, he's a traitor. He usurped the king. It was unjust. He killed Saul. And I can't believe he took, this guy's horrible. And then he has his chance. You know, he's kind of stewing in this town that's just past the Mount of Olives. He's just over there like mad at David. And then David's coming out of the city. The city gets taken from him. Shimei is elated. He's like, yes, this is what I've been waiting for. Saul should be the king. So he runs out. And this guy's either crazy or suicidal or something because he's literally within a stone's throw of David's mighty men, the greatest warriors in all of Israel. It makes a point of saying that in verse 6. All the mighty men were right here. David's here, mighty men. This guy's a stone's throw away, like to the door, to the parking lot? I mean, he's that close to them, throwing stones at the greatest warriors in all of Israel, cursing them. This guy's nuts. And his whole point that he's making to David is a false accusation. He is falsely accusing David of things he didn't do. Mainly, he's falsely accusing him of usurping Saul's kingdom, of staging a coup, assassinating all of his political rivals, and unjustly taking the kingdom away from Saul. We know that, in fact, is the opposite of the truth, right? David was the one person on his kind of side of the whole battle between David and Saul who didn't ever hurt Saul's people. In fact, when he found out that people had killed Saul's guys, he killed them. He's like the opposite of what Shimei is saying here. Of course, we also know that theologically Shimei is way off. God took Saul off the throne, not David. It wasn't just human politics that David kind of took over when he wasn't supposed to. God gave David the throne because he took it from Saul. So this guy comes out slandering David, falsely accusing David, and also insulting him greatly. He says he's a man of blood. He says he's a worthless man. And the last time, does anybody remember somebody else in the story of 1 and 2 Samuel who was called a worthless man? It was a long time ago. It was way back at the very beginning of 1 Samuel. If you remember, Eli's sons, they were called this exact same thing, worthless men. Remember what they were up to? They were sleeping with women in the temple. People would come with their offerings, and they would just take them and eat them. I mean, they were horrible. They were worthless men. That's what Shemaiah is calling David. This is a horrible insult. It's not true. It's slanderous. It's a false accusation. And he comes throwing stones. Some people think that the throwing stones are symbolic of him saying, this guy should be stoned. He's committed capital crimes. We need to stone this guy. People, the enemies of God's king, will come and continue to curse him. Of course, we see this very evident in the life of Jesus, God's true king, the true and better David who came after. Constantly throughout his ministry, Jesus was accused of sins he never committed. He gets accused of blasphemy like 100 times. Constantly, people are accusing him of things he didn't commit. And of course, Jesus received far worse cursing and mocking and reviling as he went to the cross. Executed for sins he didn't commit, executed for crimes he didn't commit, and cursed by all these people, spit on, mocked as he goes to the cross. And as God's people, as followers of Jesus, we will experience the same cursing. Like I mentioned, Jesus says we will be hated because they first hated him. We will experience those who curse us. Again, I think, and we will experience false accusations. People who either don't understand or willfully don't understand. Again, I think the biggest example of this is when we try to lovingly confront someone about their sin, lovingly tell them about the gospel, tell them that there's a king who can save them, and they turn around and say, well, you just hate me. You must just hate me. And it's caused this rift in a relationship. They're reviling you. They're accusing you of things you never do. It's the opposite, in fact. You love them, and they're cursing you and saying that you hate them. This is going to continue to happen to us. What should we do? What should we do about this? That's what we see in the final section of this passage, starting in verse 9. Then Abishai, the son of Zeruiah, said to the king, why should this dead dog curse my lord the king? Let me go over and take his head off. But the king said, what have I to do with you, you sons of Zeruiah? If he is cursing because the Lord has said to him, curse David, who then shall say, why have you done so? And David said to Abishai and to all his servants, behold, my own son seeks my life. How much more now may this Benjaminite? Leave him alone and let him curse, for the Lord has told him to. It may be that the Lord will look on the wrong done to me, and that the Lord will repay me with good for his cursing today. So David and his men went on the road, while Shimei went along the hillside opposite him, and cursed as he went, and threw stones at him, and flung dust. And the king and all the people who were with him arrived weary at the Jordan, and there he refreshed himself. So the whole way they're going to the Jordan, this guy's just walking next to him and throwing stones and screaming at him. Abishai immediately jumps in. He's like, David, who is this guy to curse you? Let me go kill him. Let me execute this guy. Abishai, you might remember, he showed up in the story before. He's Joab's brother. Joab is David's general. So this is like the second in command of the armies of Israel. And he's a brave, great warrior. If you remember in 1 Samuel when David went into Saul's camp, they snuck past all the people sleeping, and he stands right next to Saul. He asked for somebody to come with him. Abishai went with him. He's like, I'll go with you. They get to Saul, and Abishai's like, oh, David, please let me pin him to the ground, David. Come on. Here's our chance. Let me kill him. And David restrains him there. These sons of Zeruiah, Joab, and Abishai, they are very quick to rush to violence. And a lot of times they're right. I mean, in this case, Shimei definitely could have been killed. It was a crime in Israel to curse leaders in Israel. You can look at Exodus 22, talks about that. Cursing a leader in Israel was a crime. This would have been a justified execution, especially with the level of insult and false accusations this guy's continuing to. David would have been completely just to go wipe this guy out. Abishai is, in a way, Abishai is right. But David, he literally distances himself from them. He goes, what have I to do with you guys, Joab and Abishai? He's kind of lumping them together because they constantly do this kind of thing. He's like, I don't have anything to do with you guys. You guys are misunderstanding this. Like the way that has been happening through this whole story, 1 and 2 Samuel, David knows that the way he gets back to the kingdom is not through violence. He's like, remember how we didn't execute Saul's guys? Remember how we've never taken the kingdom by violence? We're not going to start now. We're not going to execute this guy. You guys need to calm down and stop doing this. But more than that, It's very reminiscent of Jesus and Peter in the garden, right? Jesus is going to the cross. He's going to, he's about to be crucified, and Peter starts whipping out the sword, and Jesus is like, stop. Same idea here. David knows this is not the way we're going to do this. And why does David do this? What's the main reason David gives for not executing Abishai, for letting him just walk along, or executing Shimei, and letting him walk along the road and curse him for like miles? What's David's reasoning? His reasoning, ultimately, is the sovereignty of God. He says twice. It's a really interesting, weird phrase that he says, not what you expect him to say. Verse 10, if Shimei is cursing me because the Lord said to him, curse David, why are we going to kill him? And you're like, what, David, what are you talking about? God didn't tell him to curse you. And then he says it again in verse 11. Let him curse, for the Lord has told him to do so. And you're like, David, what are you talking about? I don't think that God appeared to Shimei in a dream and said, hey, go curse David for me. What David understands is that Shimei actually is speaking better than he knows. Although Shimei is slandering him and leveling false accusations against him and insulting him for something he didn't do, Shimei is actually right that David is a worthless man, and David knows it. David knows that though he didn't murder Saul's household, he did murder Uriah. He did take Uriah's wife. And though Shimei is wrong that God is giving the kingdom to Absalom because of David murdering Saul, Shimei is right that God is still punishing and disciplining David for the sins he committed against Uriah and Bathsheba. Nathan the prophet told David that the sword would never depart from his house. The sword would rise up out of his house, in fact. And that is exactly what has happened. His own son has risen up against him in violence. His house has been a mess ever since that event happened. And so what David understands is that though Shimei is slandering him and accusing him, at the end of the day, he is in fact a worthless man, and he has been humbled before the Lord. He has humbly realized that he has sinned against the Lord, and because he has realized in humility that he has sinned against the Lord, he's accepted his punishment, he's repented of his sins. Because of that, he's able to be humble and patient in the face of wild cursing and accusations against him. He trusts in God's sovereignty, knowing that, you know what? I have sinned, and God has graciously spared me, and he is in control of all this stuff. I do deserve to be cursed. God sent this guy. I do deserve to be cursed. But what does he say in verse 12? It may be that the Lord will look on this wrong done to me, and that the Lord will repay me with good for his cursing today. David leaves vengeance in the hands of the Lord. David completely trusts his life to God. He knows that it's not his place to avenge himself in the face of cursing. He knows that he has to trust God to bring good out of this situation. Just like he's been doing his whole life, trusting God to give him the kingdom, not taking it for himself. Now, as he is down and out again, humbled from his sins, he places his faith and trust in the Lord and says, you know what, Lord? I trust your sovereignty. I trust your plan. I do deserve this cursing. And I pray one day, Lord, that you will bring good out of this whole situation. Jesus Christ is the ultimate picture of what's happening to David here. The ultimate example of God bringing good out of cursing. This is the point of this whole passage. The world will take advantage of and curse Christians because they first did the same thing to Christ. But Christ humbly trusted the Lord to repay him with good, and so should we. Jesus is the example of true humility that we should be following. Remember that verse we read at the very beginning of the service about how Christ humbled himself to take on the form of a servant. And he didn't stop humbling himself there. He remained humble even in the face of completely false accusations, even in the face of mocking, even in the face of cursing from all of his enemies as they led him to the cross. And he wasn't just cursed by people. Jesus Christ literally became a curse for us, hanging on a tree, cursed, so that we might be free from the curse of sin and death. He did all of this without retaliating, even though he certainly could have. It was well within his rights as God to execute those who were accusing him and mocking him. But he did not. He went to the tree to literally become a curse. Why? Because he knew that God was going to bring good out of this cursing. He knew that because of the cursing he was receiving on the cross, that his people would be freed from the curse of sin and death. This is how we should live as Christians today, when we, as God's people, as citizens of his kingdom, as subjects of Christ, as we live in this world and we receive cursings. The main application of this text is really simple, is don't retaliate when you're cursed. Trust the Lord to bring vengeance, to avenge you, to stand up for you. You aren't even able to do it yourself. Just trust the Lord to bring good out of the cursings that you receive in your life. That's the main application. That's a really easy application to say and a much harder one to do. It's very easy to be in here on a Sunday morning and go, yeah, all right, I'm not going to retaliate when I'm cursed. It's a much different thing when you're with family members this Christmas in a fight about your faith and to not retaliate and come back at them and try to defend yourself, but to let God do it. I think this passage gives us two ways to help us to do this. When you are faced with someone who's taken advantage of you and gotten away with it and you're hurt and you're upset, when you're facing someone who's cursing you and upset with you and falsely accusing you of things, how are you actually able to not retaliate? How are you able to be like David and like Christ, trusting in God to bring good out of cursing? There's two things that David does here that we can also do. The first one is to trust in the sovereignty of God. David has a rock-solid, unshakable trust in God's sovereignty. David understands that vengeance belongs to the Lord, and that at the end of the day, the only one who can avenge him, defend him, is the Lord. He's not going to be able to do it himself. You remember in Romans 12 when Paul, he quotes the Proverbs and he says, when people are attacking you and you love them in return, you're going to heap burning coals on their head. He quotes that from Proverbs. And just think about Jesus' teachings in the Beatitudes about who are citizens of his kingdom. What do the citizens of Jesus' kingdom look like? In Matthew chapter 5 in the Beatitudes, how about those who mourn? Blessed are those who mourn, for they shall be comforted. When you're mourning because someone has cursed you, falsely accused you, be comforted knowing that God will comfort those who are in mourning. How about blessed are the merciful, for they shall receive mercy. When we show mercy to those who are attacking us, we receive mercy from God. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called sons of God. Who are the ones who inherit God's inheritance? Who are the people in his family? They're the ones who strive to make peace. They don't escalate the situation. They try to make peace. And then these final two Beatitudes speak exactly to the situation that David is in and that we will find ourselves in. Blessed are those who are persecuted for righteousness' sake, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. The citizens of the kingdom of heaven, those who are a part of God's kingdom, are those who will be persecuted for righteousness. And finally, verses 11 and 12, blessed are you when others revile you and persecute you and utter all kinds of evil against you falsely on my account. Rejoice and be glad, for your reward is great in heaven, for so they persecuted the prophets who were before you. So it's even more than just not retaliating in the face of cursing, in the face of being taken advantage of. It's actually rejoicing in the face of it. How is it possible? How is it humanly possible for us to not retaliate and to rejoice when people slander us and accuse us, it says? Well, it's not actually humanly possible, I don't think. It's possible because we have Christ's Spirit within us. He empowers us to do this. And as we cling to his sovereignty, cling to God's sovereignty, and know that when you are persecuted, your reward is great in heaven. Know that when you are persecuted, God sees that, and he will take care of that. Know that when you are persecuted, Christ Jesus is going to come again in his second advent to make all things right. So even if you don't see the justice in this world, God will take care of you. No accusation can stick to you. You have the righteousness of Christ imputed to you. You will be okay. Cling to God's sovereignty, trusting that you will be rewarded and rejoice when you face these persecutions. There's one more way this passage tells us that will help us. When you face this situation, how can we do this? We need to have an accurate view of ourselves as redeemed sinners. The only way David is able to not retaliate and kill Shimei here is because he has been humbled by his sin, saved from his sin, and he realizes that Yeah, he in fact deserves worse than cursing. He deserves worse than stones and dust flung to him. He deserves death. It's actually the very gospel itself that saves us, that enables us to bear cursing. We, like David, are worthless people who have committed evil sins against our King. And so when you have someone cursing you, you can realize if you have been saved by grace, if you have been saved by the blood of Christ, nothing you did saved you. All you did was evil, and God saved you and rescued you. So when that person's cursing you, you can rest in that and know that, yeah, you know what? I actually deserve death for my sins. So it's okay if this guy curses me. I've been saved from all my sins. The gospel, where we go from being wretched sinners who humble ourselves before God, place our faith in Jesus Christ for salvation, because of that, we are actually enabled to fight against and rejoice in the face of these cursings, because we've been humbled first by our sins, we've had them forgiven, and now no accusation can stick to us. We have Christ's righteousness imputed to us. We have an advocate before the Father who's saying, yeah, all that stuff's not true, and I've covered them. I've covered all their sins. When you truly realize that your sins deserve crucifixion and that you are saved from that, you are able to bear with people accusing you of things you didn't even do. You deserve far worse than that. The grace of the gospel enables you to withstand these attacks from the world. There's this a great quote from Charles Spurgeon that speaks to this situation. Brother or sister, if any man thinks ill of you, do not be angry with him, for you are far worse than he thinks you to be. If he charges you falsely on some points, yet be satisfied, for if he knew you better, he might change the accusation, and you would not be better by the correction. If you have your moral portrait painted and it is ugly, be satisfied, for it only needs a few blacker touches, and it would be still nearer to the truth. My enemy, whatever evil he says of me, does not reduce me so low as he would if he knew all concerning me that God does. God knows our deepest, darkest, most horrible sins that we have committed against him, and he still chose to save us, to send his Son to take care of those sins on the cross, his Son to become a curse so that we could be freed from that curse. And for those who are freed from that curse, nothing can touch us. Nothing can bother us. If we cling to the fact that we are sinners saved by grace, then we are empowered and able to respond with love, with rejoicing in the face of enemies of Christ. And think about the testimony that this is to the non-believers in your life. If you are going to see non-believers over Christmas, hanging out with them, spending time with them, think about the testimony it is when we as Christians rejoice in the face of these conflicts, of these cursings, accusations. It shows them the power of the gospel in our lives. In fact, because David spares Shimei here, he is later able to show mercy to Shimei in another sneak peek into chapter 19. This passage teaches us that because we are loyal citizens of the King, we will face persecutions, we will face people trying to take advantage of us and curse us, that we can and should humbly and patiently bear that and wait for God to bring good out of cursing. Our God is a God who brings good out of evil, blessings out of cursings. He's been doing this all throughout human history, from the beginning when Joseph was sold into slavery in Egypt, to then rise through the ranks, and then he says, hey guys, you meant this for evil? Well, God meant it for good. God has continued to do that all the way through history, all the way up to Jesus Christ, where we crucified Christ, meaning it for evil, we cursed him on the tree, and God was able to bring the greatest good out of that cursing in our salvation in Christ. We should put our faith in Christ to take care of us as we loyally and humbly, patiently follow our King Jesus, striving to be more like him as we rejoice in the face of suffering.